it actually is a higher degree of need in many areas than urban areas. So for example, when you're talking about poverty or health disparities, life expectancy, it's actually all worse on average in rural America.
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series, and in today's conversation, we're going to discuss investment in rural America. How can companies advance their social and environmental goals, generate tangible business returns, and help bridge the urban-rural divide? Joining me today is Paul Washington, the Executive Director of our ESG Center at the Conference Board. Paul, as always, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be with you today.
So, the ESG Center just released a new report calling for companies to better support rural America. Before we dive into the report findings, let's start by saying, what is rural America? What do we mean when we say that? There's urban, there's suburban, and then I guess rural, right?
Yeah, there is, but it's actually pretty stunning that there is no single government-approved definition of rural in rural America. It's really extraordinary. In some ways, it's often defined as areas that are not urban, if you can believe it. But there are different ways of looking at it. You can generally people look at a governmental jurisdiction, and they look at the total population in that area. They look at the density of the population in the area, and they look at the use of land in that area. So there are three different approaches in this area. In many ways, rural America, which is actually a lot more diverse than a lot of people think in many ways, is something of a combination of all three. It's got a certain level of population, a certain level of population density or lack of density, and the land use is it's for farming, it's for forestry, it's for those sorts of things.
All right, so just a layman's use then, it's basically farmland, it's open land, it's forest land, it's small town America. So it's really outside of the big urban areas and which have suburbs. So that's right. How we think about this.
That's really it. And there's a lot of it.
Well, I think people think of the rural America as being, sort of the Midwest, Iowa, Kansas. Right. But there's a lot of rural areas in the Northeast, once you get outside of the New York urban area, outside of Chicago, outside of LA, you just get a little bit further out, and it's definitely rural. So there are rural areas everywhere in every state.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in upstate New York in a town of 6,000, and our congressional district is the sixth least densely populated district in the United States, and that's just 2 hours north of New York City.
That explains a lot about you, Paul, but we're not going to get into that.
Well, that's a separate podcast, Steve.
All right, so rural America is sparsely populated, a lot of different diversity. So when you look at the United States and its landmass, then what sets apart rural areas from urban areas, just out of simplicity?
Yeah, a lot of things. I mean, I'll talk about some of the things that set it apart. Obviously, lower population, different use of land. There are also things that set it apart, which we can talk about more later. But it actually is a higher degree of need in many areas than urban areas. So, for example, when you're talking about poverty or health disparities, life expectancy, it's actually all worse on average in rural America than it is in urban America. And that may go counter to what a lot of people think. It's also, as we'll talk about, it's actually really quite diverse. And there's a diversity in rural America. People tend to think of it as a largely white population, but you've got a lot of people of color and in different levels in different parts of the country. The American rural South is different from the American rural Midwest or Northeast or Southwest. So it's interesting. There are certain commonalities, but there's a great degree of diversity even within rural America in every sense of the word.
Yeah, so you've talked about it in terms of more demographic, but attitudinally there are big differences between rural and urban America.
Yeah, I think so. Look, having grown up in an area, we talked, actually, Steve, you and I talked about on a recent podcast biodiversity, and we talked about biomes, which is the ecosystem that exists in a particular area, whether it's in a forested area or grassland area. There, you can think of, in some ways, rural America as a different kind of biome. That's a different use of land, different cultural norms in those areas than in urban areas, different economic basis in those areas, different social basis. It is in many ways distinctly different from suburban and urban America in terms of, obviously things like the pace of life.
Well, and, we're a country of immigrants in the United States. So, you find different immigrant pockets.
Exactly right.
Rural America too, which drive cultural differences and views. You also see big political differences. We're nonpartisan. We don't talk about this, but there are political differences driven in large part by their social views. And this goes back to ethnicity and so forth in each of these areas. So real big differences, pocket to pocket around the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, your report also notes that, rural America is 97% of the land, but 20% of the population. That tells you something.
Yeah, that gives you a lot about population density. Exactly right.
And so let's go then to the need, because I think people and companies tend to be headquartered in urban areas. There are some exceptions to that, and the larger the company, the larger the urban area, it seems, but it correlates.
Yeah.
And so companies tend to give philanthropically, and their activities around ESG tend to be focused in and around their corporate headquarters, which leaves 20% of the population kind of without this whole support group, doesn't it?
It does. And look, and so our report notes that only about 5% of the large philanthropic grants coming from corporations and other sources are made in rural America, despite 20% of the population there, despite the needs that exist. And, there are a lot of factors that feed into that, Steve. I think part of it is that the larger institutions that might receive big grants, museums, symphonies, hospitals even, tend to be in urban or suburban areas. So the organizations that can receive big grants tend to be there. The money is often in urban areas and suburban areas. That's where companies and other philanthropic organizations are headquartered. So you've got the recipients are in urban areas, the money is in urban areas. You also have, frankly, a lot more attention, I think, over time in our country has been paid to the social and economic needs of urban areas than rural areas. So there's just a lot more press attention to those needs. And then there's something else that, is understandable as well, which is, in some ways, if you're going to tackle a problem, whether it's racial inequality or economic opportunity or educational attainment, it can be more efficient, frankly, to do it in an urban area because you're able to reach a particular population, a large number of people more efficiently than you can in rural America. So all those things sort of work together, unfortunately, to the disadvantage of rural America in getting philanthropic attention.
Well, the other thing is that rural America on average is poorer than urban America. And when you adjust it for government support levels, it's poorer yet because
yes,
government support tends to follow the population, because it's the government support goes to a person, whatever the program is. So it's at a person level. And so when you total up the dollars go more to where the people are, which is the urban area. But you see less support going to these rural areas. So their needs are multiplied by their lack of governmental support, and also their lack of these philanthropic grants that go. But
Absolutely.
But their needs on a per person level are still there. And I think that's the point of your.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, rural America, when you talk about the issues there, compared to urban America, and again, this may be different from a lot of people think, but higher poverty, higher mortality, lower life expectancy, lower economic and educational attainment, greater health disparities, and on top of that, weaker infrastructure. And that infrastructure is not just traditional infrastructure of roads and bridges and so forth, it's also digital infrastructure. I mean, the broadband, nearly a fifth of rural America doesn't have access to broadband, which is a vastly different from the picture in urban America.
Yeah, broadband technology, but also deliveries and so forth. I think in the urban areas you can expect delivery same day or next day at worst. But when you get out in these rural areas, it can take many days to get there. I mean, we're not doing Pony Express anymore, but it is different in the economics for companies delivering in rural areas, whether it's delivery of packages, a la e-commerce, but also delivery of healthcare. I mean, a lot of people are 50, 60 miles away from any kind of healthcare support.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, there are a couple of, healthcare is a really great place to focus on here, because there's as much as there are trouble in terms of labor shortages in urban and suburban America and healthcare workers, the shortages are really acute in just for healthcare workers in general. In rural America, it's a long distance to a hospital, could be a great distance even to a doctor. So it's interesting, in rural America, pharmacies are often the main source of healthcare in a rural community.
Yeah, and it's interesting, they people in rural communities even call the pharmacist doc, and they go and they get advice on things other than just a transactional purchase of a prescription. So it's a really different attitude, because they are the most informed and educated people, and the most accessible people from a healthcare perspective. So all of these needs add up, and I think the point of your report is to say, okay, look, we get it. 80% of the population's in these urban areas. We get that. We understand. But 20% isn't. And this 20% is part of your supply chain. It's part of your customer base. It's where all the food is grown. It's where all the mining is done, and the raw materials, where all the forestry is done. So all go all the way back up through everyone's supply chains, all these companies' supply chains. And that's where the source of all these materials come from. And we need to support those areas. And from an environmental standpoint, we need to support those people in those areas. All of these things, it's a very complex set of issues.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I think the pandemic, among other things, caused everyone to be aware that you need to think about your company's workforce not just within your own four walls, but think about your supply chain upstream and your customers downstream, and their economic and social health are as important to your company as those people who work directly within your own four walls. So for companies to thrive, no matter where they're headquartered, you really need a healthy rural America.
Yeah, and you can't do the kinds of tasks and provide the goods and services that are being provided in a rural America, not to go back and repeat the list that I just went through, but you can't do that virtually. You can't do a Zoom call and mine. You can't do forestry over Zoom. You can't do farming over Zoom. So the pandemic had less of a change in lifestyle and a change in needs in these areas.
Right. And you pointed out something awfully important. This isn't something that can be picked up and moved, right? Rural economies, there's a reason why they're there and what they're producing. And so they're irreplaceable and they're indispensable to the health of the American economy.
We're discussing corporate investment in rural America. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Paul Washington, who's the Executive Director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board. Okay, so Paul, let's go back to what companies can do about this. You know, you made a series of recommendations in your report, which, you know, the overall theme is that companies, you know, really need to do a lot more. What are some of the key points in the report?
Well, a few things. Companies should really actually do a needs assessment of rural America, whether they've got facilities there, or whether there are customers there, or they've got suppliers there, and look at the connection between their business and the communities that they may want to serve. So you start off by doing a needs assessment. You listen to the needs of the local community as you would do in an urban area. But here are a few things that stand in the way right now of companies directing philanthropic dollars to rural America. One is there are fewer nonprofit recipients in rural America compared to urban and suburban America. So what do? As a company, you can expand your definition of grantee. You can give money to libraries, to hospitals. You can give money to regional foundations. So you can expand the ambit of the folks to whom you support. The other thing you can do in terms of getting a better sense of the needs in rural America, and I thought this was one of the more interesting ideas that emerged from the report, is make sure you're actually hiring from rural America when it comes to your executive ranks, right? Look at people who actually have some background in rural America. You know, don't just hire necessarily from the coasts for the big cities. You know, there's something to be said for that. I think sometimes people just hire where they're comfortable, and we've seen that. And, you know, put rural America on your map when you're thinking about hiring for senior positions, because frankly, that increases senior management's awareness of the needs in rural America. It's to my mind, that was one of those unexpected insights that came out of our discussions with companies.
Well, and not just senior folks, but if you do have the ability to hire remote workers, there are remote workers in the rural areas who do have broadband access and who can work remotely, and you know that would be a huge lift to those communities.
Absolutely. I mean, I was lucky enough to grow up in a small town where IBM operated not too far away, and the combination of a rural environment and all the support you have in a town where people know who you are, plus the economic opportunity that was offered by a major employer like IBM, was just enormous. It meant, frankly, that the 95% of the kids in my high school graduated, and about 70% went off to college.
Wow, that's an incredible stat. So what do you say to companies who say, well, look, you know, I understand what you're saying, but our headquarters is in New York, and that's where we've got all of our headquarter employees there. We got our foundation head there. So our focus is on New York, and really, you know, we don't feel a connection to these other places. What do you say? Well,
I'd say there are three really powerful reasons why companies should consider directing more of their corporate philanthropy to rural America, more of their citizenship investments. The first is those areas are critical to your business. You may not have a concentration of employees there, but you do have a concentration of suppliers and customers there as well. So, they are important to your business. You may also have employees there. So, and even if your headquarters aren't there, you may have satellite operations there. So it is important to your business. These areas are important to your business. Second, they are also a very natural extension of the issues that you may be focusing on already in your corporate philanthropy. Take diversity, equity, and inclusion. Rural America is actually rather diverse. You've got about 20% of rural America are people of color. You've got 15 to 20% of the LGBT community nationwide is actually in rural America. So you actually have a fairly diverse population. If you're interested in advancing diversity, you can do so in rural America. If you're interested in addressing environmental issues, actually the needs in rural America are even greater than those in urban and suburban America. So second thing, it's a natural extension of your programs. And then finally, if you're a US company that cares about the economic alienation and political polarization in our country, you need to pay attention to rural America. You alluded to that earlier, Steve. We live in a world where there's this red-blue divide, urban, rural divide, and companies can address that by directing attention and resources to rural America. They can make a huge difference in how corporate America is perceived in rural America and actually knitting back together the social fabric of this country.
Yeah, and you mentioned the environmental, which most companies have some sort of sustainability environmental contribution. 97% of the mass of the land mass, and therefore 97% of the environment is in rural areas. So
yeah,
it's just a natural fit.
Yeah, and look, if you care about climate, then you actually care about preserving plant life in rural America. If you care about biodiversity, well, that's where the species are. If you care about water quality, for goodness sakes, and think about rural America in terms of water supply and water quality. It's all there to be addressed. So if you actually care about, and I think companies do, they care about their home communities. But gosh, it's we're all part of one broader American ecosystem, and rural America, is a critical part of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned this briefly, but it's easy to go directly to recipients in an urban area. You look people in the eyes and you can deal with it. You don't have the same freedom to do that in rural America just because the lower levels of population. But there are lots and lots of nonprofit partners. So I think
yes.
instead of direct philanthropy, companies need to start thinking about partnership philanthropy.
And different types of partners, including, and here's something where there's been a big gap in corporate philanthropy generally, but it's actually in working with other companies, because again, you can increase your efficiency if you're working alongside other companies, and frankly, with government agencies. We did a survey and only 30% of the companies that are engaging in corporate philanthropy in rural America are actually working in conjunction with government or taking government into account. And as you pointed out, government is already providing massive support to rural areas. So it only makes sense for corporate America to look at what the government is doing and figure out a way where there can be effective private-public partnerships. Because, this is one of the issues where, frankly, if companies can work effectively with government in rural America, they might be able to sort of set the standard for how they can address working with government in other areas, including natural disasters, including issues like racial inequality. Companies often are going alone in these areas. And frankly, in rural America, they can't. They need to work with other companies, different types of nonprofit organizations, and government.
Well, and a lot of companies have employee contributions going to, the big nationally known organizations, the
Yeah.
art organizations, the Red Cross, those kind of organizations. But you should be thinking about pointing the application of those donations to rural America. In other words, you don't have to try to look up every local library group in rural America. You can get there even through these national contributions.
That's an enormously helpful and practical suggestion, Steve. So that's something companies can do because a lot of philanthropy is done through employee grants or matching grants from the company, and making sure it's almost like, your 401k options, making sure that there are options to serve rural America, and frankly, educating your own population about the needs, your own corporate population about the needs of rural America. Look, the media are concentrated in urban America. So those are the areas that get more attention. And frankly, the needs of rural America haven't gotten the same degree of attention. Companies can step in and at least do something to fill the gap and make sure their employees understand the needs of rural America and understand the needs of rural America and how it connects to their own company.
So everything we've been talking about kind of has been one way, the benefits to rural America by companies investing there. But what are the benefits in return that companies can expect?
Well, you can think about it. Think about your customers. They're more healthier customers, right? Economically and physically. So you've got a better, population that you're serving, more reliable and resilient suppliers. Whether they're directly supplying your company or whether they're supplying food, right? So better suppliers, better customers. The other thing is, frankly, for companies that do have remote workforces, it's more places where your employees can work. And for companies that are thinking about relocating some of their facilities, maybe to lower cost areas, a healthier set of communities in rural America provides a company with more options as to where they may want to locate their facilities, because they will want to locate their facilities in a place with good education, good healthcare, good cultural opportunities, and so forth. So the more vibrant rural America is, the more options corporate America has for where they will set up shop, where they'll have employees, and so forth. And then finally, it is in corporate America's best interest to have an economically healthier America, a politically less polarized America, less economic and social alienation throughout our country. I think there's probably no CEO in America who would argue that we'd be better off if we could diminish the polarization and alienation. And a great way to address that is by focusing on rural America. What's in America's interest is in corporate America's interest.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the point about facilities. I know when companies think about their facilities, they think about the headquarters facility, and that's pretty hard to put out into a rural area. But there's a lot of other kinds of facilities, whether they're back office facilities that don't need to interface necessarily every day with the group at the headquarters. There are plants that produce things that are can be in these areas, and call centers, all these other things. And the cost of labor can be lower because the cost of living is lower in those rural areas. So companies can actually lower their cost base by establishing whatever facilities they can in these more rural areas.
Absolutely right. It could be distribution facilities, it could be data farms, it can be call centers, a whole variety of different types of operations can be run either in a main facility or in a dispersed workforce in rural America.
Okay, final thoughts on the report. Anything we missed?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add is, while this report focuses on corporate citizenship, that's corporate philanthropy, volunteering, and so forth, I think its message is broader to corporate America, which is what you think you know about rural America may be based on some sort of false and outdated assumptions. It is a very diverse area in so many ways. Its needs are multiple and urgent. And frankly, it's, the opportunity for companies to advance their own economic interests and our country's social interests and economic interests for our entire country are there. So I think, to the extent that we've been able to shine a light on rural America, through the lens of corporate philanthropy. My hope is that CEOs across this country read this report and think about how to address the needs of rural America, not just through corporate philanthropy, but through their own company's operations and more broadly.
Well stated. Paul Washington, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Steve. It's always great to be with you.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in ESG, public policy, economics, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, with everybody you know in rural America. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.